the Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
What was that? Ash got baby Grogu over his shoulder. Was that him talking?
Yeah, that was Grogu.
It was saying to me, y'all shall sing the song.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Did you know that since 1978, CEO pay at top companies is up over 1,000%? Well, average worker pay is up only 24% during that time. We're breaking down CEO compensation on today's show. I'm Stephen Sakach here again with Tullio Siragusa and Ash Maher. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Last month, a report came out. So we're reading reports from the Economic Policy Institute, so you don't have to. But last month, they reported that CEO pay actually declined last year, but it has soared 1,085% since 1978. Well, as I mentioned, typical worker pay rose 24%. This is just looking at the top 350 firms in the US. So if you go back to 1965, so 60 years ago, CEO pay at the time was 21 times the typical worker. In 2023, that was 290 times, and that was down from 400 times the typical worker. There's a graph that went along with this report, and you can kind of see CEO pay edge up slightly in the late 70s before it doubled in the 80s, setting the table for the dot-com boom of CEO compensation, and things have never been the same. So what happened in the past 60 years? There are some key things that set the table for this and left worker compensation behind, and that's what we're going to talk today about. So Tullio, let's go over some key moments and trends that contributed to this rise in CEO wealth concentration. Take us back to the 70s where we've got bell bottoms, disco, gas guzzling cars, three-piece suits, and those wide ties. What happened in the corporate world besides that?
Well, someone comes out with a brilliant idea and everybody just follows along. So in this case, Milton Friedman's doctrine. In the 1970s, economist Milton Friedman famously argued that a corporation's sole responsibility is to maximize profits for the shareholder. And everyone followed suit on this. So this shifted corporate focus from stakeholder focus, which included employees, community, and the environment, toward shareholder returns, justifying increasingly large executive pay and aggressive cost-cutting measures. So it became all about you get rewarded for generating shareholder value. At what expense? Well, we have a whole history of things that have happened.
Yeah. We talk about this a lot.
We could dig into all that came out of that. And then in the 1980s, stock options as compensation was introduced. As if it wasn't enough to have a huge paycheck, let's give a piece of the pie, which creates even greater return for these CEOs. But so these stock options based on performance became a thing as well. Now, while it was intended to align a CEO with the company's best interests, it also encouraged short-term profit maximizing behavior, such as, just making the profits at all costs, even if you have ethical practices, whatever it takes to make your bonus. That's kind of what drove a lot of the behavior.
So yeah, we talk about those two things a lot, is that, that single shareholder purpose and how many issues come up from that. And then we also talk about that short-term incentives for CEOs and how a lot of that can just cause a lot of problems. So mid-1970s, you begin to see that CEO compensation start to creep up, outpace employees a little bit, but it didn't really start taking off until the 80s. Ash, what's going on then? We've got MTV, we've got big hair, neon clothes.
And we had an actor for a president, right? We had Ronald Reagan coming in with deregulation and essentially getting the government's hands out of business, right? So with the leaders of championing deregulation and free market policies, this reduced government oversight on businesses. So when that oversight was reduced, what happened? Well, people leaned back on what they enjoyed the most, the bonuses, right? Maximize those profits, make that money, and get your bonus, right? So this created more room for corporate strategies focused on maximizing profits and justifying high executive pay. Because I own this company, I get to justify what I get paid now that the government is not involved. And then additionally, we have globalization that occurred, right? So as companies globalize, they face pressure to compete on a global scale. So the bigger is better mentality took hold. This fostered competitive pressures that emphasize maximizing profits and cutting costs, leading to larger CEO compensations as rewards for achieving such goals. So as you hit the global market, things are getting more competitive. You're outpacing the competition, maximizing those profits, cutting those costs, and here's your bonus, right? So an element of both of those things were going on. Deregulation from the government, as well as a massive competitive market where, again, the focus leading back to the 70s was maximize those profits. And they just leaned back and like, hey, let's hit that hard. And that's pretty much where the disco, transitions into towards the 90s.
So, and then in the later part of the 80s, we saw a rise in leverage buyouts. And this is often pointed out of where the dam really broke. So private equity firms began using LBOs to acquire companies, and they often would restructure them aggressively to boost profits before selling them off. CEOs of these companies, kind of learned from this model and started prioritizing cost cutting and short-term profits to attract, investor interest, and then which often translated into higher compensation packages for them. And this is where you see the junk bonds used for financing these deals come in. And now there was this single incident that people point to as being the thing where the dam broke for CEO greed. And if you haven't seen the movie Barbarians at the Gate, I recommend it. It's older. It's got James Garner, Fred Thompson. I highly recommend it. I just read the book. And so this is often pointed out as kind of the single incident. It's the RJR Nabisco buyout in 1988. And so this was the largest LBO at the time. It was about $25 billion. May not seem as much now, but back then it was just massive. And so it garnered all this immense media attention and publicity. And then as part of this, the CEO then, F. Ross Johnson, had this massive compensation package in there that was made people kind of even blush at the times. It was just sort of this embarrassing thing that they're like, man, if this ever gets out, it's going to cause trouble. There's going to be some bad publicity on it. But they went ahead and pursued it. And of course, eventually it got out. And people are like, whoa, you can make that kind of money. It just kind of set the bar really high. One thing I noticed throughout that book too is they documented everything really detailed, like all the board meetings, the conversations, everything. And they almost never talked about how their actions would impact the employees. There's maybe a couple sentences in some of this talking about that sort of perspective on things. This was all just about that stock price, how we can get it higher and this whole battle. But again, great movie. Even if you aren't into the topic, it is worth the time. Very detailed book. So by the time, I don't know, it might be too detailed of a book. So that's what I'm saying, check out the movie. So by the time the 80s ended, that CEO compensation went from about 30 times the average employee to 60 times. So it kind of doubled. And this incident really showed that sky's the limit and you could go beyond all that. And let's head into the 90s. We've got grunge, we've got Nirvana, Pearl Jam, right? Tullio. What followed in the 90s and the 2000s with business, where leading up into this, where people said, oh, wow, you can make that kind of crazy money?
Yes, the 90s and the 2000s, it was really about the dot-com boom and the tech explosion. Now, what's interesting is that up to now, all compensation was tied to real money, real revenue. And this kind of reveals a little bit of the whole model of the dot-com and the technology space, because, you aggregated more money by doing a lot of acquisitions, and which became the thing, right? So, but if you were a startup, you didn't have that kind of clout. So to compensate some of these superstar CEOs to come in and go do these startups, they had to find a new model. So what happened during the dot-com boom is you had valuations of companies driving everything, right? I remember there was a commercial once on TV. It's like, we don't need your money. We have VCs throwing money at us. It was like so arrogant. I'll never forget that commercial. But that was really the mindset, like taking extreme risk, CEOs willing to take extreme risk on speculative growth. It wasn't even real revenue. It was like, can you get the valuation of the business to a point where it can be sold? So you're buying a business not on real revenue, but on the possibility that it could get to that revenue. So it's all speculative. And a lot of these CEOs created incredible results for this. So you had the tech CEO culture emerge from, those who came from the big giants who brought in that mindset of growth, but, didn't have the revenue, but still focused on the valuation. And that created tremendous wealth for a lot of individuals. And it got shared, some of that, with the rest of the employees through those stock options. So there was a good thing. The stock options was introduced. And there were some people, even some janitors who walked out as millionaires in some of these dot-com exits. So it was very much focused on whoever's willing to take the highest risk gets the highest financial reward. And it definitely influenced compensation structures across all the industry, because everybody wanted to mimic that too. So interesting how this whole thing's evolving so far.
So what's interesting, like you mentioned, that risk, so there's this high risk mentality really that came into play there. And here you see salaries, they went through the roof, above 300 times the average employee, I think peaking at 384 times. So 6 times where it did in the 80s. So that's just a huge shift in a short term, 10 years.
One thing noticing in this 30-year span, nowhere in any of those models was any thought to improving people's lives or impact on people. It was all a money grab. How you play with the financial way of doing things to maximize profits and income for those who are investing. It was all shareholder value. And of course, the CEO that was mostly aligned with that, willing to do whatever it took to create that value, got compensated, like extraordinarily compensated for it. Mm-hmm. Nowhere in there is any discussion about adding any value to anyone other than this group of people.
Yeah, other than if you're lucky enough to be, one of the 10 in the door on one of these dot-coms that just took off. So, Ash, the recession in the later 2000s, it didn't exactly put the brakes on anything. And we talked about the risk mentality. And so what happened here?
So now it's 2008. To Tullio's point, people at the time did not consider the implications of their decisions of maximizing these profits. Now we're going back in time to earlier when people were selling these junk bonds and people were buying the junk bonds. And now that was entering the market. So now you would think there'd be implications. All of this selfishness, all of this greed is going to blow up in everyone's face and it's going to hurt a lot of people. Is it going to hurt the CEOs? Well, let's see what happened in 2008. In 2008, the financial crisis illustrated how too big to fail institutions could take excessive risks over the course of decades, in this case, with minimal consequences when it all finally blew up in their faces, as governments often bailed them out. This reinforced the notion that CEOs could be highly rewarded for high-risk strategies without significant personal or professional repercussions. Now, this is where it gets worse. There was stock buyback surges. So in the wake of the financial crisis, companies increasingly use stock buybacks to boost their own stock prices, thus directly benefiting executives whose compensation was tied to share price performance, often at the expense of reinvesting the company or workforce. So instead of making the company better, there was a ton of films about this as well. I forget which one of them was, but essentially they end up cutting the entire workforce, bought back their stocks, kept their stock inflated, and they got to live another day because the government came and rescued them. But it's crazy. You would think that after all the decisions, who gets hurt? All the people. The people get hurt, and at the end, they're able to get out.
Oh, Yeah, so
They're
CEO
playing
compensation,
Monopoly. They're playing
CEO
Monopoly.
compensation is shooting up. It's shooting up higher and higher. And then even when they're failing, it's like, we'll bail you out. You guys can't fail. But meanwhile, we got to cut some costs somewhere. And so, while things are pretty good at the top, people were struggling during the recession, and, wages just, not going anywhere for the average employee, right?
Terrible.
You
So
can equate the whole thing to Monopoly game. You're just playing with Monopoly money, and then when you get a get out of jail free card, which was all the bailouts, and then if it didn't work out, you just put a new board and then start over because it's not real money; it's Monopoly money. Yeah,
it's just so disconnected from real people and real problems. So Tullio, after this, what was really kind of the next?
It's really interesting how this continues to have been built on this idea that started in the 70s with Milton Friedman's doctrine, right? It is a continuation of that doctrine. It's like, how do we keep topping it? Okay, so now you got the rise of unicorns in the past 20 years or 15 years, really, from 2010 onward. So you got venture capital influence, where in the 2010s and above, you saw an explosion of unicorn startups, many driven by venture capitalists with massive valuations and expectations for quick, lucrative returns. Not returns on real money, returns on valuation. So this created a culture of rapid growth, often justifying high compensation packages for executives that were willing to and could promise to deliver disruption. And then, of course, the Silicon Valley ethos, which was like moving fast and breaking things, that became the culture, and cultivating startups like Facebook encouraged rewarding structure where executives received large payouts for creating shareholder value, even when practices or impacts were controversial. So that, so everybody's chasing the unicorn, becoming a unicorn. So you get I went through one myself. We had a $1.5 billion exit. We didn't have $1 billion in revenue. We had $300 million in revenue. So you could just imagine the major, that was a big success story, but still a 1.5 billion unicorn status for 300 million. So you're not getting compensated on real revenue. You're getting compensated on some wild valuation that the venture capitalists all agreed to work with. Crazy.
There was a film that came out, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago on Netflix. And it was during a time when this was all happening. And they were talking about how you can go up there and literally talk about the craziest app with dummy data. In this case, they were promoting a dream app that didn't exist. And he was able to inflate based on his storytelling capabilities to get the venture capitalists to come in and buy into his dream app. But a lot of that was happening. People were trying to capture those unicorns. And really, these visionaries were storytellers, right? And trying to create a vision of something that was not even really there. And dummy data.
Theranos. I mean, that was a dream teller, storyteller. The whole thing was predicated on nonsense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's kind of this next area, right, Ash? After what Tullio was just talking about, is now we get this rise of celebrity CEO kind of culture, right?
100%. So this cultural shift occurs where now the CEO is the celebrity. We're talking about the Mark Zuckerberg, the Jeff Bezos of the world, the Elon Musk. So over time, popular culture began to glorify CEOs as geniuses or visionaries, contributing to celebrity-like status for business leaders. This trend has only grown with figures like Elon Musk, Bezos. We talked about who's the other one? Mark Zuckerberg. Even these guys in the media world, the Grant Cardone, Tyler, they're all geniuses, right? And they're all their own personal brand, and they're all big and mighty. And so the personal brand's tied to their company.
So now you're really, when you're in that business meeting, it's about this person a lot more than actual stuff. I kind of think of like Arrested Development, and he had, what was that called? This face block app or whatever. And so they thought of him as like some kid genius and just throwing money at him without any real. You'll figure it out. We know
that sparked up a whole hustle culture too, of people wanting to be the next billionaire and pushing and raving about getting up at 4 a.m., working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they want to become the next celebrity status entrepreneur.
How awful was it, those gurus that are taking pictures in private jets, and those jets are not even flying anywhere. They're just taking pictures of them because they're trying to use the media at the time to portray that they have all this success. So media influence, the portrayal of wealthy CEOs in media, and the normalization of high compensation as a metric for success contribute to the expectation that successful CEOs are those who amass great personal wealth. So it was really painting this picture that you're not just a CEO who does right by your people, who has created great value. You're also flying in jets. You're being followed around by cameras. You're doing all this and that. And that created a whole new character of what a CEO is, which again, inflate. They're able to ask for more money. Hey, I'm famous. I'm a celebrity. I'm Gary Vaynerchuk. So costs $200,000 to come to a virtual call with you guys, which is, by the way, a reality. He charges around $100,000 for a virtual call. So it's things like that. When you talk about the transformation with media involvement.
I'm way underpriced, man.
Right?
Yeah,
you just go viral, just jump off, just something crazy, go viral, and now you're
gonna get Tullio in some jets and in front of some cars and mansions.
That's it. Tullio live the high life, the rich life.
So so what has really changed for the better here after all this?
It got worse.
Like 24% growth for the average worker wage is ridiculous. And we're talking, 400 times now the average worker salary here with CEOs versus 24%. And we're telling them, hey, just, you got to work harder. You got to hustle more. You got to do this and that. And people now can't afford rent that's going way up. Has anything here changed for the better as far as business with this compensation gap? If you're at the top, it's great, right? But
it hasn't. Think about it. They're pushing for these massive salaries, which is supported by increase in pricing for products and goods and service. But you're keeping the employee base way down or disconnected from that. So you're the very same products and services you're increasing the rates for to maintain the compensation for the executives are making it difficult for your own employees to survive. It's actually a thing that's going to collapse. It's not sustainable because you're alienating the very people that are creating that success by starving them. So it's not a sustainable model. It isn't. And that's why we keep having these roller coaster ups and downs and massive inflation issues, because it's being pushed by this artificial thing that only a few benefit from. And the rest are just like, I'm making this happen.
Yeah,
it's costing me more to survive, but I'm the one making this happen. Why am I not getting compensated fairly so that I can also participate in the success of this thing? Because these people didn't do it on their own. They had employees that made them successful. So it just I guess it really just comes down to not meeting the needs of people, and ultimately it's going to backfire. It's already backfired for a lot of companies.
And to piggyback off of what Tullio just said, I think there's an evolution occurring with employees expecting more out of their employers and having options, right? So employers that have upped their consciousness levels and are now really focusing on the betterment of the value that they're driving for their clients and what they're selling to consumers and customers, and then how they're taking care of their employees. Those are attracting some of the better talent. And I think ultimately people have seen that a lot of the media is really based on a lot of untruthfulness. I think there's a lot of people questioning media, what they see on social media, for example. I think the day of the CEO taking the private jet and showing off, I think that's dead. I think that was cool maybe 5-10 years ago. Not 5-10, sorry, 3 to 4 years ago, man. Time's like complete. But 3 or 4 years ago, that was something that was really big, right? So that's died off, I feel, right? I think people are like more like, hey, we want real. We want to be connected with people who have a Northern Star, have actual values. And I think that we're seeing that evolution occur slowly. So a lot of these big CEO compensation packages, if they're able to create value for customers and clients, and they're able to create great value for their employees, I think that CEO is always going to be compensated more, but I think it will balance itself out over time.
But just think about the cultural norm that needed to be created to sustain this. Many of us were sold on this idea of You buy a house, over leverage yourself, buy a nice car, buy a nice house, be in debt, push yourself, right? That was the norm, right? So, and you just did it because you want to take care of your family.
Yeah.
The newer generation was like, no, we're going to live in co-ops and share home and keep our costs down and not put ourselves in a place where we're having to act like slaves, to make a few people really rich. I mean, because that's really almost what's kind of happened, right? So I give a lot of credit to the newer generation of just like, we're not playing that game. We're not getting sucked into that. We're not going to be suckered into that, because technically most of us from that generation totally got suckered into that, right? We got sold this idea and this dream that we could be that guy or that gal, and it's fleeting. So the risk should have rewards, but it should be shared with those who participated in those risks and made those risks turn into successful outcomes.
Yeah.
And not having that in place is a lack of grace and a lack of appreciation for the effort that the people did to make that possible. And for a long time, that they got away with that because we kept being sold the dream and chase the dream. But the new generation is like, show me the money now. I don't want the dream. Give me something real.
Yeah, and what we've seen with those, we've talked about this a lot, is those conscious capitalist type companies that actually do, like you're talking about, can you share the wealth, where their employees end up being the highest paid and they end up being the most profitable among their peers as well. I mean, so they don't just have to, you don't have to just squeeze, employees to be the most profitable. No, they're showing time and time again that you can be, in my industry, I'm going to pay the most, but I'm also going to be making the most as well because of some of these conscious capitalism types of ideals that they hold and they bring to their business, where it's not just, about our company. It's about the environment. It's about our customers. It's about our employees. And we're all kind of sharing in this, and people appreciate that. And so in conscious capital, in the book, I think they talked about, maybe it was Whole Foods, and they proposed what it was like a 21-to-1 CEO salary compensation, something like that. Which really goes back to that, 1965 ratio back there, to where it was before all of this stuff that we just talked about, which, it was pretty good back then. And if everyone's salaries rose equally, the 21-to-1, the one should be making a lot more than 24% than it's making right now since 1978, which is a little ridiculous. I think, when I think about like models of business, the one that kind of comes to my mind that's interesting to me is the NBA and how their collective bargaining agreement works. It's where like the players make 50% of whatever the gross revenue is. The players are going to make 50% of that, and that's going to be the salary. And the ownership side gets the other 50%. And, that's got to go to obviously, running the arenas and things like that as well, and the marketing and all that stuff. But it gets really interesting because as they sign these better contracts and they're, better ambassadors for their business, they're all making more money along the way. They all share in that growth. And it's not just, the players having a static salary during this growth, which is what we're seeing in all these other companies, is that the employees have this really static growth where up top it's just gone through the roof, and it's not this shared principle. And I mean, that's taken, for the NBA, that's taken a lot of back and forth with the players union and the owners, and becomes this really interesting part of the actual game of basketball in a way, is because you can only afford so much, and here's your chess pieces to play in this market. But throughout that time, this is why you see all these salaries going way up. So the NBA, this is just one solution out there, right? Of just trying to figure out how we can make this work for all stakeholders in the situation. Tullio, people are trying to figure this out, and obviously because it just doesn't feel healthy. What are some of the creative ways that we're working toward looking at compensation?
This has been a very heavily discussed topic amongst my radicalpurpose.org co-founders. Most of us came from self-management environment, but one of the things we realized that even within that space, you still have some ownership challenges, and a few owners can make a decision that impacts the entire group. So we started thinking about this idea of co-owned instead of just co-managed or self-managed, but co-owned or co-ownership, which is a model where it's kind of like a cooperative, but a partnership where based on your individual contribution, the recognition could be different at different times. So it's based on a system of contribution to the overall gets compensated fairly. So it could be a team that's really killing it one quarter and they pull through, and you've got to recognize that with more compensation. It could be the CEO who had a breakthrough idea, and that could be compensated with more money. But it's creating a model where you are working as a group, as a team, as co-owners to the success of fulfilling the company's purpose, which this only works if you have a good purpose in place too. Mm-hmm. So there are models we're experimenting with, but the entrenched approach right now is so deeply ingrained that thinking outside of that is very difficult, very challenging, because you don't want it to end up looking like some socialist thing either. That's not the solution.
Yeah, so you still want like the free market to be
people. If they contribute, they should get paid, right? But you kind of create it where it's an opportunity for everyone to make that kind of contribution and recognition. And that's not an easy thing to do. I don't have the full answer to it, but we're definitely exploring some possibility with these ideas of RADs, which is a new way of dealing with stock where it's based on contribution and commitment. And if you want to take a break, you can do that for 6 months to a year, and you're still participating and getting compensation and then come back in. There's new models that I think are worth exploring that still generate significant results and value, but do it in a way that everyone benefits from it who's actively participating.
Yeah, I wonder if at what point the salary, it is, what's the wage divide here? If the ratio becomes, what's too much, where it's like the government is going to be like, okay, this is just too much. And they're going to come in and say, hey, from this sort of, if you're making this amount of money at your business, then here's the ratio for CEO salary compensation. And this is what it's going to have to be. And you get this sort of government restrictions on things in there. I know they're trying to do it with like personal income tax as well, but it feels like at some point there's probably a, that's too far kind of thing. And then if we don't find some sort of solution prior to that, you may end up with a solution that really isn't in the best interest of anyone.
Here's an idea. Instead of paying that excess tax, just distribute some of that money amongst those employees who are on the lower percentage of tax brackets and help them out a little bit, because you're going to give up that money anyway. Might as well give it to the people that work there.
Tullio, I got my earnings report coming up, and I've got, and I need to hit my marks, or I'm not going to get my big time CEO salary bonus, right?
I know, but you're going to be paying through the roof on taxes on that big salary bonus. So just share it with the rest of the team. Why lose it to the government? Lose it to the rest of the team.
But that hasn't motivated them yet to do anything about it.
Because the taxes haven't, the implication hasn't been, there's always a loophole, right? I'm suggesting make the loophole, but the people, give it to the people.
So. I mean, again, we're talking about like very large corporations in a lot of this, it's not like the small business where, they'd be like, I wish I could have a 21-to-1 salary. But yeah, I think people are becoming more aware of this CEO employee pay gap. And so it's just going to become more and more of an issue. And I don't know that there's obviously a solution out there that's working for anyone that's really well known right now. Right. So there's going to be solutions that are going to come along, and people are trying different things right now. But if something doesn't come along soon, I think
It's
We're
not
gonna
going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because if you think about it, within this model, it also destroyed a lot of entrepreneurs and small businesses. It took them out, right? With this big conglomerate model, it took them out. So now if you compensate employees well enough, well, they could potentially use some of the money they're making to reinvest into creating another business, which then creates more competition, which is not good because they just took most of those out. So the system is set up to keep people down because in order for these big businesses to have succeeded, they've had to do a lot of consolidation. And through that process, small businesses disappeared. And so that disparity, it's intentional and it's nefarious. But people are beginning to see that. And it's like, I'm not going to sign up. I'm not signing up for that. I won't work for you. I'll just be a contractor. And more need to do that. That's the only way it's going to shift is people will say, no, I will not take this job unless you compensate me properly. Or I'll just go work for myself. And if you want my services, I'll contract them to you. But that has to be a massive collective consciousness shift, which I think could happen with the newer generation.
I think it's happening, especially in that area with purpose and meaning. Give me a more purpose and meaning. Because I know early in my career, as journalists coming out of college, we were paid less than teachers, right? It was like the lowest on the pay scale. So you're not doing that for to get rich. You're doing it because you felt this higher purpose involved in that. And so people will make some sacrifices in that regard if it's a higher purpose that they believe in. And so if you aren't providing like meaning into your work, you're treating your employees just as cogs in a machine, they're going to go somewhere else. And those who are like these conscious capitalist firms that we talked about, they're going to get the best people and they're going to pay well for it. And it's going to be a big differentiator for them. Hopefully, we gave at least some background on how we got here with the CEO compensation. I don't know if people really, paid attention to the steps along the way, but where things go from here is really hard to predict. But we do know that's our show for today. So if you haven't yet, tune in for our live discussions with guests on Thursdays. I've been wanting to take a lot of notes on these lately, so they've been really good. And man, some of the answers to my last questions have been superb. So until then, have a great rest of your day, and we will see you on the next Bliss Business Podcast.